Hi guys, welcome to Investing with JYK. I know I promised a copper market analysis, but we're currently in West Virginia, so we're just trying to check out the mountain state, and then I have all my research stuff back at home. I'll try to do that about maybe tomorrow or day after. So today we'll look at Apple, as suggested by a viewer. Um, so Apple is quite different than the rest of the FANG stocks, um, in the sense that they are consumer facing and manufacturer. Wait, not a manufacturer, they're a hardware company. They sell hardware. So if you think about the FANG, you got Facebook, Google, which is software, and Amazon, which is retail and software, basically. And Netflix is software, and then um, maybe other than and if you want Nvidia, which is really not consumer facing. They're a hardware designing shop. So Apple is kind of unique in that sense. And in terms of valuation, in terms of like PE multiples, Apple is one of the lower. They're in the high teens at the moment. They've been as low. I think they're, what are they now? Their PE is 17, yeah. So they've been as low as something like 9, I remember back in like 2015 or 16-ish. Um, but their PB is pretty high. If you see, the PB is like 7, and that is as high as Facebook, basically. So they're a hardware company that has a PB that is as high as a software company. So um, essentially what that means is their margin is probably very high. Their profitability is really high. And then you can see that the ROE is like 40%, which is insane. Um, which is why it justifies a very high PB. And the ROA is slightly lower. Well, not slightly, it's quite much lower. That's basically just leverage, but it's not actually that much debt they're taking on compared to their earning power. So it's quite they're in a quite nice position. So today we'll just discuss mostly like how like try to figure out how Apple makes money in on a high level, and mm, try to see where these product lines might be going. Okay, so Apple very nicely lays out. If we search for iPhone, their products. So they have iPhone, iPad, and Mac. Right? And so these are the hardware things, and they actually have some other stuff which they, yeah. So here the other hardware is in the other products part. You got the accessories. So they have the headsets and AirPods and HomePods and all that stuff. And then you got Apple TV, which is fairly cheap, like $100 something, and Apple Watch and Apple Touch. That's where they sell. So the big ticket items that you have here is um, iPhone, iPad, Mac, and are the Apple Watch. So one thing that um, you have to keep in mind is that not all of these are as profitable. Um, iPhone is one of the more profitable phones. They have something like 40% plus gross margin. That's probably not doable on an iPad if you think about it. If you look at iPads, right? So on a iPhone X, people pay like $1,000, and an iPad 9.7 inch, the top of the line. Um, well, this is not the iPad Pro, but the normal iPad is only 400 in fact. And if you buy the iPad Pro, you can get it for something less than 1,000, I think. Yeah. So you got the 10-inch one, which is 650, and then the 12-inch one, which is $800. And if you think what goes into the phone and what goes into the so this thing is $900,000. The sheer size is going to tell you there's a lot of more things that goes in the iPad. Now, inside, iPad usually has a bigger CPU, a much larger battery, a much larger screen, a resolution screen. It's not as nicely crafted as an iPhone, but it's just a lot more stuff. So in terms of profitability, I would say, iPhone would definitely be more profitable than iPad. And if you're into this stuff, you can check out, I guess you can Google like iPhone gross margin or something. And there are investment banks that try to figure out how much these cost. Yeah, here we go. In this case, iPhone X is the profit margin is much higher than I said. It was like 60% for the iPhone 8 and 64% for iPhone X. Right? And you got these things here. And if you use to iPad margin, so 45 to 61% depending on, that's iPad Air. Let's see if there's anything new. See if there's anything from last year. Well, doesn't nobody? It's not immediately visible. Yeah, here we go. Apple makes twice the profit margin on iPhone sales than it does iPad. It makes perfect sense, and you can see the gross margin from sales to 2008. Well, there's some kind of erosion, but doesn't match from what we see. But in any case, you can see that it's better for Apple to sell an iPhone than an iPad. And the other thing is okay, let's look at Macs, right? So imagine you have a MacBook. The MacBook's like $2,500. But for the same thing, you can get a Dell for the same spec. If you want to go to Dell, and you want to buy something with similar spec, it's probably going to be like $1,700 ish. So let's see for I don't know, for home maybe. Let's get a 7 and a 16 gig and solid state. Okay, so what do we have? So you got the cheap ones, which Inspiron, which are the cheap, but the Inspiron is definitely one of the cheaper models. It's quite not that nice. So if you go for Alienware, which I guess is, or XPS, what about this guy? Let's see, we want SSD. Yeah. Let's see, what are these? What is the difference here? You got the same. Doesn't say about graphics card. Probably something to do with graphics card. But Apple does sell at a much higher price. It's like $2,500 for a top of the line MacBook. So yes, they get a higher margin, but also they use this aluminum unibody, which is extremely expensive to manufacture, because essentially they just got a whole block of aluminum and then just machined it. A very expensive process. So it probably costs Apple a little bit more to manufacture, but not that more, and they charge a decent premium over everybody else. But again, I do not expect gross margin. Probably like 30% is as much as I would expect. And if you go down to these accessories, headphones are notoriously high margin stuff, but people don't buy that much. And then there are small Apple TV, very cheap, $129 I think, or something like that. Um, it needs quite a bit of hardware in it. You need a CPU, obviously. You need memory. You need graphics card, and you need the connectors, and you need the housing. So doesn't sound like a high margin item to me. And Apple Watch might be one of those. Unfortunately, Apple doesn't disclose their gross margin on each of the lines, which is kind of sad. iPod Touch is basically dying, so we can ignore this. So, looking at hardware, you got things that are 60%, maybe something that are 30%, and iPhone basically just takes the crown for everything. And then the other thing that they sell are these um, services. Now let's look at these. This is actually fairly interesting, mainly because this is the fastest growing segment. So think about iTunes Store. How much is the gross margin? Probably extremely high. The cost of goods sold is electricity and server basic server depreciation. And Mac Store, same thing. Um, sorry, the iTunes Store and the App Store, same stuff. There's basically no cost to each additional software sold. So this is like a super. This part is like super high margin stuff. Music, I'm not entirely sure what the actual deal is with the copyright holder, but iTunes Store, they just take their cut, and depending on how you account for the revenue, I think let me think how they account for the. Yeah, actually, I'm not sure how they count their revenue. If they account the entire transaction as a revenue, then the margin would be something like 20%, 30%. Um, if they only account for the, if they only counted the 30% itself as margin as revenue, then it's almost 100% of that is going to be your gross profit. iCloud iCloud is interesting in the sense that it tightly integrates with Apple hardware. Apple hardware, so that's its competitive advantage compared to, say, Dropbox or even Google Drive. Obviously, this whole iTunes stuff and then Apple Store is directly integrated, but that's proprietary. That stuff is it's you can say the same thing about like Google Play Store or something. Um, Apple Care mostly is like extended warranty. Not entirely sure what the margin is, but it's going to be fairly high because if you look at extended warranty services such as Square Trade or something, Apple Care charges a higher price. So it is likely that they have a fairly reasonable uh, margin. Apple Pay, the money they get from this is quite little. I think this is more to increase the appeal of Apple devices, because the bank needs to take a cut, the merchant bank needs to take a cut, the acquirer needs to take a cut, which is like the vendor part needs to take a cut, Apple needs to take a cut, and so there's only so much fee you can charge a merchant before the merchant basically says no to any of these payment methods. Okay, so those are the ways they make money. These are the things they sell. The change in each of the revenue lines. So they have it. Let's see. 10Ks have so much stuff. I think somewhere here, close. Here. iPhone is majority of the sales. It's like 60%. This is close to 60% of this. And iPad this is like less than 10%, and Mac is about 10% plus 12. And then you got services, which is a little bit higher than Mac, and other products, which is the AirPods, the Beats headphones, and Apple Watch, fairly low. So just by looking at this, you can see Apple Watch isn't a hit. And then even in terms of units, iPhone just trumps everything. So yeah, so Apple at the moment, at least at the moment, is still basically iPhone. 60% of that is iPhone, and more than 60% of the gross margin, the gross profit is going to come from iPhone. Because as we said before, iPhone has the highest gross margin, and they have the highest units, they have the highest revenue, so everything's iPhone. I would say, 70% of company depends on iPhone. But if you look at the change, iPhone is mostly stagnating. It's not growing much, even after having iPhone X, which is much higher in price. It's like, I think it was something like 50% more, close to 50, because it used to be $649 for an iPhone, and now the top of the line iPhone is $1,000. So even with that, the revenue growth is only 3%. The unit growth is 2%. It's fairly low. But the highest growth comes from services, and you can see this thing's been consistently growing. So I'm just thinking it would be nice if they could break it down a little bit more, but I'm just thinking it's probably just people playing more games and paying more stuff, all the in-game purchases. People will suddenly start buying a bunch of Apple Pay. And the other part is they probably buy more iCloud. As the iCloud storage gets filled up, people start paying for the additional storage. It doesn't strike me as a super high margin thing, but obviously I can see that people will be willing to pay a little bit more compared to like Dropbox or Google Drive if you're using Apple devices, because of the closer integration, and then all the essentially the password saving and all these nice things. So, but that on itself is usually more of like a commodity service. You got Dropbox, Box, Microsoft Drive, Google Drive, and all these cloud storage solutions. And yeah, it's hard to charge an exorbitant amount in this regard. I mean, coming from thinking from that angle. So yes, it's probably just sales in iCloud and sales in software and games and in-game purchases, stuff like that. But the nice thing about services is that I mean, overall, it should be even a higher margin than iPhone. And also, it doesn't put a strain on supply chain because there's nothing to supply other than, say, iCloud. You probably have to provision a few more machines. Um, in terms of iPhone, if you think about the demand curve, when the new thing gets released, everybody rushes out to buy the same thing. That puts a huge strain on the supply chain. Apple needs to figure out how to have enough products stock stockpiled to meet that demand, which surges at the beginning and then fairly quickly dies off and kind of tapers off. But for these service things, uh, there's none of that need, and on top of it, a lot of these will be recurring, like the subscription stuff they have on software or iCloud. So I like those a lot. So if Apple's able to grow services a bit more, they will be less dependent on iPhone. And the other danger on iPhone is this: it's always possible that people will slowly migrate, or not migrate, in a sense that it's possible for people to come up with a better um, product, and then it's possible people will just switch. Um, you see that happening in China. So if you look at Greater China, uh, it's actually declining compared to both 2015 and 16. And if you think about what's happened in China, I mean, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but in China there are 3, 4 very competitive smartphone makers. So people made the switch. Fewer people bought iPhones. And that is always a danger. And what if these smartphone manufacturers start pushing out of China? I don't know. Um, and then for iPhones, you always have to come up with a new thing every year, and it has to be it has to be better than everybody else, and at the same time it has to be better than yourself last year by quite a bit to entice people to upgrade. So that's always a worry. And in terms of iPad, it's even a little worse in the sense that the upgrade cycle is going to be even slower. Right? For a phone, you use it, you charge it every day. 2 years later, your battery's dead. You want to buy a new phone. Very few people will go out and change their battery. Um, I do. I get very happy because I don't have to buy a new phone. But if you think about iPad, the battery is much larger, so you only charge it maybe once a week, and the number of cycles that the thing lasts is much longer. Sorry, it's the same as iPhone, so it's gonna be, the battery is gonna die in let's say 5, 6 years instead of 2 years. And what do you use on an iPad? Mostly just watching TV or watching video. And um, I have rarely seen people using iPad for productivity. So really, if you're just watching video, the iPad 2 is iPad Air 2 or iPad 4, or it's almost as good as iPad Pro. So why would I upgrade? In terms of Mac, the upgrade is even slower, simply because Intel isn't upgrading their chips as fast, and the majority of the performance gain for Mac really just comes from the CPU. So these are all in this upgrade cycle that is somewhat iffy. But for services, because you got recurring revenue and people just, Apple doesn't even need to develop these games. There are people that are trying to make these games and constantly. So it's a lot less likely that everybody's going to fail at attracting um, consumers, and some of them will succeed. And doesn't matter who succeed, Apple's going to make their money. So that's a nice part. And if we look at this quarter's numbers, let's see. Yeah, if you look at this quarter's numbers, you can see that the other products jumped up a lot. And what is the difference here is they start selling HomePods, and then the other thing is AirPods and started selling late last year, and I think I started seeing more and more people wearing them. So that is also counted into other products. But these are still just hardware, right? But services has grown even faster. Well, not even faster. Services has grown really fast as well. You can see this stuff is 31% increase. And now, in terms of percentage, this is now fairly respectable. You got 61137, 15% of the revenue. If you look at last year's number, it was something like 12%, 13%. So this is growing pretty decently. So maybe Apple eventually will turn into more of like a software company and sell services, a lot more stable revenue compared to the hardware um, devices. And then the whole thing about Apple selling hardware is probably the reason they fetch a lower PE compared to the other FANGs. And you may notice that I didn't even go into Apple's uh, other numbers, for example, their operational costs and their balance sheet, because in the end, the risk on Apple isn't liquidity. We know it's making a shit ton of money. It is not operational efficiency. Tim Cook is really pretty good at managing his company, and nothing is going out of control. And I've friends that work in Apple. Everything seems to be following a pretty decent plan, and they are also pretty. They have a reputation of managing their supply chain extremely effectively too. So those are not what I worry. Apple is really a product-driven company. So for um, this type of company, I would say we should spend majority of our time understanding their product, what the future of their products are, and less on assets or even cash flows. These are not worries. It's very different compared to, say, mining companies where the product doesn't matter at all, because we know there is a demand for the product. We also know that they cannot differentiate in their product offering. All you can do in those companies is increase operational efficiency. Very different business model, very interesting to contrast. Um, yeah, I hope this is useful. A lot of that might end up sounding like just babbling, and if you think it's too much babble, let me know, and I'll try to cut those down. And see you next time.